Story number 1. Living in Midtown had always felt safe, with the predictable rhythm of a small apartment complex. 6 units facing south, plenty of lighting, and neighbors we knew by name. It was the kind of place where you recognized every footstep, every car engine, every door closing. The October night air was crisp when I stepped out to take the trash to our dumpster. Our front porch light cast sharp shadows across the concrete landing of Unit 5, where a worn welcome mat marked our space. The route to the dumpster was muscle memory by then. Left past Unit 6, past the humming laundry room, through the iron gate that always creaked at exactly the same pitch. The security light above the dumpster buzzed, drawing moths in lazy circles. Through the gate's black bars, I could see straight down the building's length, past all 6 units to the street side entrance. Every unit had their porch lights on, creating pools of yellow that overlapped along the walkway. Mrs. Henderson in Unit 2 was watching TV, the blue flicker visible through her curtains. Unit 4's cat sat in the window, tracking something I couldn't see. The night felt different somehow. The air had that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm, though the forecast hadn't mentioned rain. Even the usual city sounds seemed muffled. The distant traffic, the neighbors' wind chimes, the rustle of leaves from the massive oak that overshadowed our building. The moss above stopped their circular dance, settling on the light fixture in a pattern that reminded me of constellation maps. I noticed the temperature dropping as I lifted the dumpster lid. The metal handle felt like ice against my palm, despite the mild weather we'd been having. My breath started fogging in front of my face, unusual for October in this part of town. The security light flickered once, twice, then stabilized, but its color had changed subtly. Instead of harsh white, it now cast everything in a slightly bluish tint. I had just dropped the bag into the dumpster when I saw my wife coming through the far gate. Her silhouette was unmistakable. The way she walked, the slight tilt of her head as she checked her phone. I lifted my hand to wave, but she seemed focused on getting inside, probably tired from her late shift at the hospital. The security light buzzed louder, and in that moment, I could have sworn I saw her figure flicker, like an old TV losing signal. But that was impossible in the well-lit walkway. The distance between us was maybe 40 feet, every inch visible under the lights. I started walking back, thinking I'd help her with her bags. My footsteps echoed strangely on the concrete, as if they were slightly out of sync with my movements. The temperature kept dropping, and the porch lights seemed to be dimming one by one, though I knew they were all still on. That's when our apartment door opened. The interior was dark. We always left the kitchen light on, but tonight it was pitch black beyond the threshold. She was standing there, calling my name in that hesitant way people do when they're not sure if anyone's home. The darkness behind her seemed to pulse, like something breathing. "Hey," I said, now just a few feet behind her. She whirled around, her bag hitting the doorframe with a thud. Her face, I'd never seen that expression before. Pure disbelief mixed with something deeper, more primal. "How did you," she stammered, backing away from me. You opened the door for me. You were inside." Her voice cracked. "You looked right at me and went upstairs." I tried explaining that I'd been at the dumpster, but she kept shaking her head. No. You were wearing this exact outfit. You unlocked the door, looked at me, and walked upstairs. I called your name. You turned your head. You looked right at me, but you didn't say anything. We searched every room, checked the windows, called the police who found nothing disturbed, but something had shifted that night, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong spot. We lasted 6 months in that apartment, jumping at shadows before finding a house across town. The new place felt different, safer, until my wife saw me walking past the kitchen windows one afternoon. She watched as I made a complete circle around the house, passing each window in turn, my gate exactly as she knew it. Except I was in the bedroom, reading. We installed cameras after that, added motion lights, but they never catch anything. Sometimes, though, when I'm taking out the trash or checking the mail, I'll catch a glimpse of movement, a familiar shape just at the edge of my vision, my height, my building, my way of walking. Story number 2. Working cruise ships teaches you to dismiss strange sounds. The constant hum of engines, the the creak of metal expanding in tropical heat, the rattle of service carts through narrow corridors, it all becomes background noise. On vessels as old as ours, you learn which noises to ignore, but some stories make you question every sound you've learned to dismiss. The gift shop sat between the theater and the casino on Deck 7, prime retail space that caught passengers coming from shows or heading to try their luck at the tables. During the day, it bustled with tourists buying overpriced souvenirs and duty-free perfumes. At night, after the last stragglers from the late show had passed through, the space transformed. Display cases cast strange shadows, and the long mirrors lining the clothing section reflected the dim emergency lights in unsettling ways. I was 4 months into a South American season when Paulo, our gift shop manager, started complaining about his staff. Initially, it seemed like typical workplace drama, employees calling in sick, requesting shift changes, anything to avoid closing duties. Paulo, usually laid back even by Brazilian standards, grew increasingly frustrated. "They're professional people, you know," he told me one evening over coffee in the crew mess. The ventilation system hummed overhead, mixing with the deeper throb of engines far below. "But they act like children, making excuses about some menina, a little girl they say they see running around the shop." He shook his head, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. "All my years at sea, and now they believe in phantasmas." The photo department manager joined us, and Paulo launched into another tirade about having to cover an extra shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us as he described how his best employee refused to work alone after sunset. The discussion eventually shifted to port schedules and passenger complaints, the usual late-night crew conversations. At 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. The photo manager's voice was tight with concern. "You need to come to my cabin. It's Paulo." The crew deck was eerily quiet as I made my way through the narrow corridor, the engine vibration more noticeable than usual. Even the usual creaks of the ship's movement seemed muted, as if the vessel itself was holding its breath. That night, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The usually warm corridor had cold spots that made my skin prickle as I passed through them. The emergency lights seemed dimmer than usual, creating longer shadows in the corners. Somewhere above, metal groaned against metal, the sound sharper than usual in the still air. Even the digital display in the elevator lobby flickered as I passed, its red numbers momentarily scrambling before settling back into sequence. The photo manager's cabin was at the end of a long corridor on the crew deck. As I approached, I could hear Paulo speaking in rapid Portuguese, his voice higher than normal. The photo manager stood outside her door, arms crossed tight against the unusual chill. She'd already called the night supervisor, she told me, but he was dealing with an issue in the engine room. Something about the auxiliary power acting up, lights flickering in sections they shouldn't. Paulo sat on the edge of the photo manager's bed, hands clasped to stop their shaking. His face had the gray pallor I usually associated with severe seasickness. The cabin's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his features as he described what happened. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his hands trembled as he accepted a glass of water. He'd been doing inventory in his office, a small space at the back of the gift shop. The door faced a long mirror running the length of the clothing section. The ship's gentle roll made the hangers sway slightly, their metal hooks clicking against the racks. "I heard giggling," he said, his English slipping as he spoke faster. "Like a child playing hide and seek. In the mirror I saw..." He stopped, swallowed. "A shadow, small like a little girl. She was peeking around the doorframe, but only in the reflection. I could see the empty doorway in front of me, but in the mirror..." The overhead air conditioning clicked on, making us all jump. Paulo described how he bolted from the office, the sound of small feet pattering across the shop's carpet following him. The giggles echoed through the empty casino next door as he fled, the sound seeming to bounce off the silent slot machines and darkened card tables. In the days that followed, Paulo's behavior changed. He started taking different routes through the ship, even if it meant walking up extra flights of stairs. During his shifts, he kept his office door wide open, the mirror always in view. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at his reflection, as if waiting for something to appear behind him. Paulo quit before the season ended. His resignation letter cited family reasons, but we all knew better. The gift shop got a new manager, and the cycle of staff complaints continued. Some nights, walking past the shop after hours, I notice how the mirrors seem to reflect angles that don't quite match reality. I've learned to walk faster, keeping my eyes forward until I reach the crew stairs. The giggling follows sometimes, echoing off the brass railings, but I never turn to look. Story number 3. Working nights in the prison ward wasn't my first choice. After 5 years as a nurse in the main hospital, I took the position because it paid better and usually meant fewer patients. Our small county hospital, built in the 1970s, rarely saw excitement beyond the occasional stabilization case before transfer. The prison wing took up just one hallway, 8 rooms total, with officers stationed at each end. I used to find the officers' presence reassuring. Not anymore. Room 234 was just another room until Marcus Wheeler arrived. He came in for pneumonia, coherent and stable enough to complain about the food. On his third night, around 2 a.m., I heard him speaking through the door. Not unusual. Some inmates talk in their sleep or to themselves. But when I checked the vitals monitor, my hand froze on the mouse. His oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low. I found him sitting up, pointing at the corner, his eyes wide and tracking something I couldn't see. "Tell that kid to stop touching my stuff," he said, voice raspy. The room was empty except for him. His meal tray sat untouched on the bedside table, cardiac leads still properly attached. My skin prickled as I followed his gaze to the empty corner. I adjusted his oxygen with trembling fingers and documented the confusion as potential hypoxia, trying to convince myself that's all it was. By morning, Wheeler was back to normal, with no memory of our interaction. 2 weeks later, we admitted Gerald Ross to the same room. Different unit, different crime, similar story. Day 3, early morning hours. This time I was at the nurse's station when the officer called me, his voice tight with tension. Ross was agitated, insisting someone was under his bed. My stomach dropped before he even finished speaking. "There's a kid under there, playing with something," Ross kept saying, his voice cracking. "Make him stop that noise." We had to sedate him after he tried to climb out of bed to prove it. The officer helped me search under the bed. Nothing but dust and standard hospital equipment. But as I knelt down to look, a sudden electric wave of fear surged through me in a way I couldn't explain. I jerked back so fast that I nearly fell. These incidents nagged at me, keeping me awake during my off hours. Hospitals are full of strange stories, but this felt different. When I mentioned it to Sarah, one of our longtime nurses, her face went pale. She remembered similar reports from room 234, going back years. Then she told me about room 123, which shared a wall with 234. The stories from 123 were different but connected. Inmates would complain about hearing children's TV shows or kids talking through the wall. We kept the hallway quiet. Policy required TVs at low volume, but the complaints persisted, always specific about children's voices. I started avoiding that section of the hallway during my rounds. I started documenting every incident, my hands shaking as I typed each new report. Over 6 months, we had 4 more cases in 234. 2 were delirious patients near death who spoke to an unseen child. 1 was a mentally ill inmate who became so violent over the kid messing with my stuff that we had to return him to his unit. The 4th was completely lucid, a man serving time for tax fraud who asked me matter-of-factly why we let children visit so late at night. I stopped being able to sleep after that one. Last week, something happened that made me seriously consider quitting. During a routine medication round at 3 a.m., I noticed the temperature in 234 had dropped significantly. The thermostat read 62 degrees, while the rest of the wing stayed at our standard 72. As I documented the issue, my breath visible in the cold air, all 3 IV pump alarms went off simultaneously. Each showed the same error code, complete battery failure. The sound made me jump so badly I dropped my tablet. When I checked the backup power indicators with my flashlight, all 3 batteries had drained completely. I fled the room, leaving the alarms blaring. That same night, the patient in 123 requested a room change. He was a former corrections officer, not the type to scare easily. His hands were shaking as he described being woken up by what sounded like children laughing and running in the hallway. When he checked his phone's audio recorder, which he'd left running out of habit, There was nothing but static and what sounded like faint humming, except for one clear moment where a child's voice said, "Come play with me. I've heard the recording." My ears rang for hours afterward. Yesterday, we admitted a new patient to 234. My heart was pounding as I checked his IV, dreading what might happen. The power flickered, just for a second, barely enough to notice. The patient looked past me toward the corner and said, "That kid shouldn't play with the lights." I turned around, my whole body cold with fear. The room was empty, but the shadow under the bed seemed darker than it should have been. I swear I saw it move. I keep telling myself there are logical explanations. Hypoxia, medication side effects, mental illness, simple coincidence. But I've stopped taking extra shifts in the prison wing, and when I have to check room 234 during night rounds, I never look under the bed. Because sometimes just before I open that door, I hear humming coming from inside, and it sounds like a child's lullaby. Story number 4, I've worked on dozens of rental properties over the years, and you get used to certain things. The lingering traces of other people's lives, the odd stains and mysterious holes in walls, the forgotten items in attics and closets. But nothing in 20 years of renovation work prepared me for what we found in that house on Maple Street. Even now, I hesitate to drive past that neighborhood. Dad bought the rental property with tenants already in place, an older couple who kept to themselves. After they passed, my girlfriend and I took the job of rehabbing it. Just another flip job, we thought. We'd done dozens before. The first day went smoothly. We started in the bedrooms, laying down drop cloths and opening paint cans. The smell of fresh latex paint covered the musty odor that lingered in the corners. Around noon, I noticed my carpet cutter was missing. We figured it got wrapped up in the rolled carpet. Happens all the time. I bought another one, fluorescent orange this time. Hard to miss. 2 hours later, that one vanished too, right off the windowsill where I'd set it. We searched every carpet roll, even unrolled them completely. Nothing. My girlfriend joked about ghosts, but something about the empty rooms made me change the subject. When we pulled up the living room carpet, the joke stopped. The cork underlayment was stained dark brown in large, irregular patches. I'd seen enough spilled wine and pet accidents to know this was different. The stains had soaked deep into the cork, spreading out in patterns that looked disturbingly like human outlines. We tried not to talk about it. The longer we worked, the more unsettling details emerged. Behind the baseboards, we found more dark stains, along with deep scratches in the wood that no animal could have made. In one corner, the cork had warped into bizarre patterns, like it had been exposed to intense heat. The previous tenants had placed their furniture carefully over these spots. Maybe they hadn't wanted to see them either. Each room held its own peculiarities. The master bedroom's closet had a patch of floor that stayed ice cold, even in the afternoon heat. The spare room's walls seemed to absorb paint differently in certain spots, leaving darker patches that resembled doorways. We went through twice as much paint as we should have, but those areas never quite matched the rest of the walls. I was painting the living room wall when it happened. The afternoon sun cast shadows through the windows, making familiar patterns on the fresh white paint. Then I saw something move, a human shape gliding across the wall. Not walking, gliding. The shadow was too sharp, too defined to be cast from outside. I dropped my roller and ran out the front door, paint splashing my shoes. The street was empty. No cars, no pedestrians, not even a stray cat. I circled the house twice, checking every angle where someone could have cast that shadow. Nothing. Just the hot afternoon sun and dead silence. We packed up our supplies and left within 15 minutes. Dad called the next morning. "Did you use some kind of chemical in there?" he asked. "Place is full of flies." We hadn't used anything but paint and basic cleaners. I went back with bleach and water, wiped down every surface. The flies were everywhere, crawling on windows, buzzing against light fixtures. The sound filled the house like static. What disturbed me most was their behavior. These weren't ordinary house flies. They seemed to move with purpose, gathering in precise locations. Always the spots where we'd found the worst stains. They would form perfect circles on the walls, then disperse simultaneously, as if responding to some signal we couldn't perceive. At times, they appeared to be tracing patterns in the air, complex geometries that made my eyes hurt if I watched too long. The temperature would drop suddenly in rooms where they gathered, cold enough to see our breath. Electronic equipment malfunction. Phones would lose signal, batteries would drain in minutes. One afternoon, my girlfriend's digital watch stopped at 3:33 and wouldn't restart until we left the property. The next day they were back, hundreds of them. The house sat on a concrete slab. No crawl space, no hidden entries. Dad poured silica into every hairline crack he could find. The flies kept coming. I vacuumed up piles of dead ones, only to find new swarms the next morning. They seemed to emerge from nowhere, materializing in the center of rooms. Something about those flies felt wrong. They moved in unusual patterns, clustering in the areas where the carpet stains had been worst. Sometimes they would form dense clouds that hung motionless in the air, like they were waiting for something. The buzzing got inside my head, making it hard to think. Dad was a pragmatic man. Depression survivor, World War II veteran, raised 10 kids through hard times. He didn't spook easily, but after 2 weeks of fighting those flies, he put the house on the market. Sold it at a loss to the first buyer who showed interest. He never explained his decision to anyone, just said sometimes it's better to cut your losses. Story number 5. I was 15 when I learned that seeing isn't always believing. My parents were away for a long weekend, some business conference several states over. I'd convinced them I was old enough to stay home alone. 3 nights, 2 days, no parties, no friends over. Just me, my PlayStation, and enough frozen pizzas to survive an apocalypse. The first night went fine. Friday passed in a blur of video games and junk food. I'd even remembered to take out the trash and load the dishwasher. Proof I could handle this adult responsibility thing. The house felt different at night, bigger somehow, but I told myself that was normal. Everyone's house feels strange when they're alone. Saturday evening started normally enough. I was upstairs in my room, headphones on, deep into a game when I heard it. Mom's voice, clear as a bell, calling up the stairs. "Honey, dinner's ready!" My stomach dropped. They weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow night. I pulled off my headphones, heart already beating faster. "Mom!" I called out, poking my head into the hallway. The upstairs was empty, silent except for the hum of the AC. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows in the corners deeper. "Come on down, it's getting cold." Her voice again, that familiar tone she always used when I was taking too long. But something felt wrong. The timing was off, like an actor missing their cue by half a second. The words were right, but the rhythm was just slightly wrong, like someone who had heard my mother speak but wasn't quite getting the emphasis right. "Mom, are you home already?" My voice cracked slightly. The house seemed to hold its breath. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then she appeared at the bottom of the stairs, just stepping around the corner from the kitchen. She wore her usual blue cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons. She looked up at me and smiled. Just smiled. Her face was perfectly still except for that smile, like a photograph coming to life. Her eyes didn't crinkle at the corners the way they should have. They stayed wide and unblinking, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I gripped the doorframe, knuckles white. She hadn't said a word when I saw her, hadn't moved her mouth at all. Just that smile, fixed and unblinking. Then she turned, movements too smooth, too fluid, like she was gliding rather than walking. Her feet didn't seem to make any sound on the hardwood floor as she moved back toward the kitchen. The cardigan didn't rustle or shift with her movement. "Dinner's ready, sweetie." Her voice rang out again, but I hadn't seen her speak. The sound came from the kitchen, but I just watched her walk in there silently. The voice was perfect, exactly the way Mom always called me, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the house like water filling a glass. A memory flashed through my mind. Mom telling me once about animals that mimic their prey's loved ones. How deep sea creatures use lights to lure smaller fish. How some birds can copy the calls of others. I thought about how predators learn the habits of their prey, how they study patterns and behaviors. How long had this thing been watching us, learning our routines, practicing that smile? My feet wanted to follow. It was Mom, after all. Mom was home early and dinner was ready, and this was normal, right? But that smile, that terrible silent smile, I couldn't make the two things match. The voice I heard and the figure I saw. Like two different channels playing at once, almost synchronized but not quite. The disconnect made my head hurt, like trying to read through someone else's glasses. The house had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the AC had stopped humming. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton wool. From downstairs came the soft clink of plates being set on the table, the familiar domestic sounds that had always meant safety and home. But beneath those sounds was something else, a soft, wet noise that might have been breathing or chewing or something worse. I slammed my door shut and locked it, hands shaking so badly I almost missed the bolt. My cell phone was on the nightstand. I called Mom's number, pressing myself into the corner furthest from the door. The ringtone seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. She answered on the first ring. "Hey, sweetie, everything okay?" "Mom," I whispered, "where are you right now?" "We're still in Cincinnati, honey. The conference doesn't end until tomorrow afternoon." "Why? What's wrong?" I heard another call from downstairs, perfectly mimicking Mom's voice. "Your dinner's getting cold." But this time, under the words, I could hear something else. A clicking, chittering sound, like insects moving in the walls. The police found nothing. The house was locked up tight, security system armed and untriggered. No signs of entry, no evidence anyone had been there. They checked every room, every closet, even the attic. Nothing but empty rooms and cooling air. But when they went to check the kitchen, all the chairs at the dining table were pulled out, places set perfectly with our best china. In the center of my plate was a single pearl button, still attached to a scrap of blue wool. I stayed at the neighbor's house that night, and every night after until my parents returned. We never did figure out what happened. Story number 6. Living on a Louisiana highway meant accepting a certain kind of solitude. Our property stretched deep into the darkness, the only light for miles coming from a single searchlight mounted past our garage. Wild things would emerge from the woods without warning. Coyotes, panthers, anything that could move through shadow. But that was normal. What sat in our clearing wasn't. I was 16 going through my rebellious phase, sneaking cigarettes at 2 a.m., sitting on the back steps where my parents couldn't catch the smell. The winter air was sharp enough to make the ember glow brighter, and most nights I'd watch the mist from my breath mix with the smoke. Behind me, the house slept. Ahead, that industrial searchlight cut through the darkness like a knife, creating a perfect circle of harsh white light. That's where I first saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Something about the way it sat there, oddly human-like, with its legs stretched out in front of it. It was picking at the ground, tail curled around its haunches. My first thought was maybe a wolf had wandered down from the north, or the coyotes had bred with someone's German shepherd. Something to explain the size. But even then, in those first moments, I knew I was lying to myself. Nothing natural moved the way this thing moved. The crawfish mounds in the clearing had been torn apart, mud scattered in long furrows like something had been digging methodically through them. Each hole was wider than my fist, deeper than seemed possible. Whatever was hunting there wasn't after crawfish. The edges of the holes were smooth, like they'd been carved rather than dug. Sometimes we'd find strange marks around them. Not quite footprints, not quite claw marks, but something in between that made my skin crawl. I'd seen plenty of animals in that clearing before. They moved differently, natural. This thing's movements were deliberate, almost careful, like someone trying to remember how to act casual. Its shoulders were too broad, its posture too intent. Sometimes it would go still for long minutes, just sitting there under that harsh light like it was waiting for something. One night, high on teenage invincibility and nicotine courage, I decided to whistle at it. Just a quick "hey there" whistle, the kind you'd use to call a stray dog. The moment that sound left my lips, I knew I'd made a mistake. It moved, not like an animal startled, but like a person unfolding themselves. Rising up on two legs in a single fluid motion that made my stomach turn. It was tall, God, it was tall, and the way it stood was all wrong, like a puppet with too many joints. The searchlight caught its outline in perfect detail. The hunched shoulders, the long arms hanging at its sides, the curved spine that shouldn't have been able to support upright walking. Then it turned its head and looked at me. I've seen wild animals look at me before, predator eyes catching light in the dark. But this was different. It wasn't just looking, it was seeing me, recognizing me. There was intelligence in that stare, and something else I couldn't name. Like it knew me from somewhere, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. In one motion, it cleared our 6-foot chain-link fence. Not climbing, just a single impossible leap. It hit the asphalt on 2 legs and loped away into the darkness, moving with a gait that looked like a broken run. The sound its feet made on the highway wasn't like paws or shoes, it was something in between. After that, I started seeing it more often. Always in the early hours, usually at the crawfish mounds or crouched at the end of our gravel driveway. Sometimes it would look toward my window, as if it knew exactly where I slept. Those nights I stayed in the laundry room to smoke, listening to the dryer tumble empty just to have some noise to hold on to. The property had other secrets. Old headstones behind the barn, strange sounds in the woods, the kind of history you'd expect from deep Louisiana land. But none of that compared to what visited our clearing. My dog knew it too. On the nights it was out there, she'd press herself against the wall furthest from the windows, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't quite see. I moved away years ago, but I still dream about that stare. In the dreams, it's always walking toward the house on those wrong legs, getting closer each night. Sometimes I wonder if that's what it was really doing. Moving closer, inch by inch, testing how near it could get. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.